DeRay, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
It's good to be here. I'm happy you didn't die. That would have been bad. It's good to be here.
So let me ask you. So you have spent, the last 5 years, 10 years, as a working activist, in real life and online. What is the difference today in terms of being an activist and making that activism come alive than if you were doing this 20 or 30 years ago?
Yeah, and I'm going to push a little bit. I don't think about it as like real life and online. Like I'm real when I'm tweeting, I'm like a whole person. So I've always thought about Twitter as like the friend that's always awake, that like, I'm telling my friend I need new deodorant, which I do need. I need like new toothpaste, and I'm saying the police shouldn't be killing people, right? Like all of those things are true at the same time. What is different now is that like 30 years ago, 20 years ago, they couldn't talk to a million people at the drop of a dime, but like we can do that now, and that's really powerful. Like I remember in the streets in Ferguson, like we could tweet and we could get 5,000 people to show up somewhere. We could immediately push back on dominant culture narrative. So that's one thing. The second is just like the pace with which information spreads is just so different now. So we can have a news story, for better or for worse, or a message spread all across the country and the world in a way that was just impossible before. So I think that those are the good parts of it. I think the bad part of it is that we live in this culture where like we just are always bombarded with feedback. Like there's just a lot of feedback coming in at all times. And I find myself even stressed out about that a little bit.
That's interesting. Tell me about that. What do you mean stressed? What is causing you the stress?
Like big and small. Like one day I tweeted about Dove soap because I use Dove soap. I like Dove soap. And people literally were like, he can't believe in black people because he uses white soap. But it was like, it was like all day. And I'm like, is this real? Like, I was like, was there like a subtext? Like, did I miss something? It's like, that's sort of crazy. I wear this vest a lot. I've been wearing it for the past 3 years. I started wearing it because it was cold outside. Which is true. It reminds me, it keeps me grounded in like why I got into the street, like what it was like. It's the same vest from the beginning, and I wore it to an Oscar party the other day, and people like had a moment, And it's like I'm getting emails about it. And it's like it's just not that deep, Like so that sort of feedback is sort of wild. On the activism side, the first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned for saying that he was trying to take me out, trying to get me killed. So I think about like the way threats and the way that sort of feedback shows up. Which is like just a lot sometimes.
It's interesting what you were saying before, that the conversation is mixed, that it's your personal life and it's your life as an activist. Can someone be an activist today without living online in a sort of genuine and authentic way? Because I think that if we were having this conversation 30 or 40 years ago, if we were talking to folks from SNCC or from the groups that ran the civil rights organizations, we now know that there was a lot of drama behind the scenes. There was a lot of personality behind the scenes that wasn't part of what was proposed for public consumption. Is that possible now, or is that a drawback? Is that a strength that you have a personality apart from your activism that people can participate in?
There's a lot of drama today that is not online, but we are definitely dealing with it offline. So I think that is still true. One of the reasons why I never criticize people who are online and being activists is that in the beginning of the protests, if it were not for Twitter, Missouri would have tried to convince you that we didn't exist. They literally would have been like, there's nobody outside. And we're like, you are literally tear gassing us, like doing all this stuff. And if it weren't for the platform, so I always think about protests as the idea of telling the truth in public, and I'll never criticize people for telling the truth, right? Like I know that we aren't born woke, but something wakes us up. And for a lot of people, it was a tweet, a Facebook post, an Instagram post, like a video. Like that is what helped them see that things were off. So like, I just am always rooted in that. I do think that we always know that like online can't be the only space, right? That somebody has to go to the city council meeting, somebody has to run for office. Like you can't do those things on the internet. But what was really powerful is that because of the internet, you didn't physically have to be present to make a difference. So people ordered us like pizzas. I remember being on a corner one day on West Florissant in the middle of the protest, and all of a sudden 15 pizzas come. You're like, where are these pizzas coming from? And like people online were like, I think they're hungry. You're like, okay. So like that's interesting. We learned how to deal with tear gas from a Palestinian activist online. Like that was actually really powerful, and like I don't know what we would have done if we had not had the internet and social media.
Yeah, and you ran for office yourself, right?
I did.
You ran for mayor of Baltimore.
Yep.
Did you find that? What was that education process like? Did you find that a lot of what you had learned carried over, or did you find that when it came to strict politics, that there was still a lot that didn't translate?
A lot translated. You know what was the hardest part about it? There were two hard things. One was small dollar giving. So the people that did Bernie's fundraising did mine, which was great. And we raised more money online at the time than any local race in the country. We raised about $300,000 in 60 days. We raised more money on Twitter than even Bernie did, which was dope. The hard part is that when you're getting like $1 and $5 donations, you teeter between like having no money and having a little bit of money, right? So there were some days when it's like we got $200, and then some days we had 20,000, and you're like, ooh. So like budgeting was sort of a nightmare. So that was hard. The second thing is that there are very few things that can compete with just in-person talking. So like knocking on doors and all that stuff was incredibly important. I think I let consultants get to me early, and like they were like, you should go to the forums. And if any of you are running for office, the thing about most of the neighborhood forums is that the people who go to them, or the people who went to them a year and a half ago, they sort of had their minds made up, right? Like nobody was being swayed at like the bicyclers forum. They sort of already cared. They already like had who they chose. Is that I could have actually repurposed a lot of that time and just knocked on people's doors, and it would have made a difference.
That's interesting. You've spoken in the past about how the platforms are a double-edged sword, right? That you're able to reach out to people, you're able to learn from people that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. But there's also a drawback of that, right? We know that there are racist communities and fascist communities and oppressive communities that use the same tools to amplify their voices. How do you think about that? I mean, when you're thinking about whether tech is something for good or for bad, how do you think about how to develop strategies for activists that speak to people who have an oppressive agenda?
Yeah, so I think the platforms definitely have a responsibility to make sure that they're safe. With that said, some of it is like they're just bad people, right? And like Facebook can't make you a better person. Like if you're just like an a-hole and you like start typing, like that's not Facebook's fault, right? And the same thing with like Twitter. It's like they can do so much to like stamp out the hate that manifests, but some of it is like people are just like not great people showing up on the platform, and like I think that is real. I think what's also changed over the past 3 years is that people weren't necessarily trying to become famous on the platform 3 years ago, whereas now they totally are. So people are like trying to take down a writer who has a great book, and people are trying to, and like that has just shifted the way people sort of operate because of the celebrity that social media has allowed to flourish in like a new way. And I think those two things are really different. I think we're just at the beginning of seeing their impact.
Do you think power has changed as a result? Like when you think about power and you think about teaching other activists how to gain and deploy power, has it changed?
I think about two things when we think about power. One is this idea of like what it means to empower people, right? Is that like I can't give you power. What I can do is help you find the power you have. That is like what people did in the middle of the street. It was like I wasn't like saying, oh my God, you have power, let me give you this. It was like, hey, you can stand here and like we can fight the system, like we can do that. And all across the country and world, you saw people like find power they didn't know they had, and like that is dope. It's why we never talk about giving voice to the voiceless, because like we would maintain that people they've always had a voice. We talk about the difference between like, what does it mean when people just weren't being heard, right? That they like had a voice, they just weren't being heard. So that's one bucket. The second is that when we think about power in a macro sense, we think about the difference between power over and power with. And power over is this notion that power is like a finite thing, like a pizza pie with an odd number of slices. And like some people have more and some people have less. We think about power with is this understanding that power is infinite and expansive, and it's actually most potent when we share it. So I think that like, what social media has done is it's helped us tease out those ideas, right? And help people see that like an ideology of domination actually will never get us free. That like we have to figure out how to distribute power in a way that like creates space for everybody. And I want to believe that the conversation is happening in that direction. I don't know if it's the platform's responsibility to actually bring that about as much as it is the platform's responsibility to make sure there's a space when people can have the conversation.
And where they can have that dialogue and they can... Are you concerned? I mean, I think if we were having this conversation before the last election, that there would be a huge amount for believing that everything you're talking about is a source of hope and that things are getting better. Obviously, the last election has been a little traumatic for some people, including probably people in this room, and hopeful for others, right? That they supported this president.
Hopefully traumatic for everybody in this room.
But it's a safe space. You can come from wherever you want.
That's him.
When you think about when you think about what activism looks like going forward, and you think about the power that folks can amass around themselves, like yourself, right? That they can go out and they can form communities much more quickly, much more durably, and be in constant conversation with them. Are you concerned about how people in this room, how people who believe in tech and design tech, that we ought to be designing tech in ways that curbs some type of folks or curbs some type of communities or some type of conversations, even if they're not unsafe?
Yeah, I think my worry about tech is the same worry that I have about philanthropy in some ways. That like so much of philanthropy is predicated on the idea that poor people just can't make good decisions for themselves, so we'll just make it for them, right? And there are a lot of people in the tech space who also are like, you know what, I love those people. I'm going to help those people, and I'm actually just going to make all the decisions for them. They just need to show up on my platform. And you're like, that's not actually the work of equity, right? Like, that's not what we want justice to look like. So in that case, I worry. I do also worry about the way that we think about the big ideas, that we think about like diversity and inclusion. Diversity is about bodies, inclusion is about culture, right? Mm-hmm. That you can recruit 50 more black students and still have a racist campus. That is like A+ on diversity, like failing in inclusion, right? The difference between equality and equity, that equality is the idea that everybody gets the same thing. Equity is that people get what they need and deserve, right? So like funding for school systems, we're not asking for equal funding, we're asking for equitable funding. We know that it costs more to educate kids in poverty and special needs students, right? So when I think about some of the platforms that I see being built and some of the people in the tech space, it's like, if you don't get like what equity, if you haven't like understood like an idea of equity, that some people literally just need different tools and resources because of like the way the system is born on their lives. And like, I don't know if you're making a real sort of justice impact, even if it feels good. And so much of the work that definitely happens in philanthropy is like feel good work.
Right. So we're going to go to questions in a second, but if you were then to build on that, issuing a challenge for the people in this room, for the people who will be watching this online, what's the challenge, right? Everyone in this room has a good heart. They want to make a difference in the world. What's the thing that you feel like folks aren't doing as much as they should be doing?
I think there are probably two things. One is that the bias is always about systems and structures, that like it's important that you've unpacked your privilege or you've thought about your own life. Like the personal transformation is really important. It is only impactful though if it like allows you to think about how we change an overall system. So like a ton of white people like doing an unpacking your privilege exercise and it's stopping there is actually not transformative. What that becomes is like the cycle of self-congratulation. You're like, oh my God, I did it. And you're like, so that's not helpful. The second is I think that there are like three types of people in the world. There are like salt shakers, there are sugar high chasers, and then there are way makers. And when I think about salt shakers, they're the people who like, they sit down at the dining room table and they just put salt on dinner before they even have tasted anything because they already know it's bad. These are the people who like, it's just never good enough, it's always bad, da, 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 da. And those people are dangerous because they've sort of pre-contaminated every solution. That they're like, you know what, racism's just here to stay, like that God created man, earth, and white supremacy. And it's like, that's just like a dangerous way to think about the world. The second people, the sugar high chasers, are people who just like chase the high. They're not chasing the work. They're not chasing like freedom, justice. They're just like, so you know, I go to city sometimes and I got a DM from one young woman. She's like, are you coming to the protest tomorrow? I'm like, what's it about? She's like, I don't know, but I have my sign. And you're like, you're just like chasing the high, right? And then the waymakers are people who like in the middle of the night with ingredients that don't make sense sort of figure out how to make a way and not only feed themselves but feed everybody around them, right? It's like I want to see more of those people.
So let's go to questions. Who from the audience has a question? No one has. There must be some questions out there. Let me, while people are thinking of their questions, let me ask you this. What have you found to be the most effective tactics? Because I think a lot of people in this room, they live in activist communities that are digital. They live in activist communities that are grassroots and are on the ground. What have you found to be successful about taking a grassroots on the ground community and moving them into a digital community? Because you did this with your mayor's race, right? You were working with people who were on the ground and you were helping them become more digital. Clearly this has happened with the podcast. There's a lot of people who are just normal folks who have become part of a community and have become active because they're listening to you. Have you found anything that's particularly effective in helping folks make that transition?
I think that it's not necessarily a transition, but an acknowledgement that we can like live in both spaces and do well in both spaces, right?
That's
That like
what do you mean?
you can like we can be online and help the organizers in Florida, and we can also and like there are people on the ground in Florida, right? That like we can sort of do it both and. I think sort of 3 years into the protest, I'm more interested in like how we help people always have a bias towards systems and structures. So like voter registration is incredibly important, but what if we helped states and cities like automatically just register people, right? Like that's like a system structure thing. So we should do the momentary stuff, which is like register people to vote. We should fight for a system that like automatically registers everybody. You know, like that's like the bias towards systems and structures. And one of the things that happens in this work is that the trauma becomes so deep that people just like forget how to imagine, that they just like forget. Like you've accepted the constraint that like your state is just like bad on voter rights, and like you sort of just like you forget that we could actually build a system where every 17-year-old is automatically registered to vote. Not when they get a car, not when they da-da-da, but like just because they turn 17. Like we can do that. You know, we can build a system where like people get mail ballots. Like that is not crazy, right? Like, but we have to dream that, and like that's what I'm more interested in is like what happens when, especially in the tech community, all these incredibly gifted people who like can build things and da-da-da, like they aren't dreaming anymore, right? They've sort of, people have accepted the constraints as is, and like how do we get to a place, I think about the police, is people ask me, am I like against the police? And it's like, well, I mean, I don't know if we need the police, but I believe 3 things. One is that there will always be rules, there will always be people who break them, and that there will always be consequences. The question becomes, what are the consequences? What are the worst consequences? And who enforces them? I'm open, right? Like, I don't know if the people who get kids who skip school need to be the people who like hunt down murderers, right? Like, I want to believe we can probably do something different there. And that when you think about like, if kids are on a corner misbehaving, like, what if we built a system that didn't say call the police, but like you called the after school provider. You're like, I see these kids outside. Can somebody please sign them up for an after school program? Like that's like a crazy way to think about it, but that's like a way to like break the constraints and say like, what would it be to build a system that just like had us interact in space differently?
And one of the things I've liked about the handbook for dissent that you've helped create online is the wiki nature of it, that we actually see people debating that question, right? What are the givens that go into a certain set of questions that we're not scrutinizing enough? I mean, do you feel like when you've worked with communities and you've helped them start to think about how to question things that otherwise that it hasn't occurred to them that they ought to question, what's the thing that breaks that open? Because it's a hard thing to do, right? It's a hard conversation to have.
I think a lot of it, and this is with reporters too, a lot of people feel like they're just not smart enough. So we did the first ever public database on police union contracts. So we got all these police union contracts through FOIA, we coded them, we made this big database, da-da-da, and we couldn't get reporters to write about it because they'd just be like, I don't know contracts. And you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna kill you, right? It took us such a long time to do this. So we posted it online, so activists across the country started to read it and look at it. So we just helped the Austin activists. It's the first city in the country where the entire city council voted against a police union contract. Shout out to the Austin activists, they were dope. And they just needed like somebody to come in and be like, you're right. So we just pulled out the clauses. Like in Austin, every single officer, when they're being investigated, they have access to all the interrogation. They have access to all of the investigation materials before they can be interrogated, which is crazy. No private citizen, if you get investigated, you don't have access to all of that stuff before they ask you a question. It's like totally nuts. So we literally just like pulled the clauses out so they could see them, and they're like, is this what it says? And we're like, yes, that is like exactly what it says. So they just needed us to come in and like say like, you're right? Like this is crazy. Yes, you should ask for something different. Like we can help you brainstorm. And we do a lot of that with people. Same thing about use of force policies. A lot of people feel like they need 3 PhDs, 2 doctorates. And you're like, that's the same thing, 3 PhDs, 2 doctorates. I was trying to think about like a tech certificate and I just couldn't get it. So 2 tech certificates, insert here. Like they just feel like they need all this stuff. And like I'm in rooms with a lot of like well-to-do people and they don't have the answers. Like they don't know either. You know, they're as confused as everybody else. So we try to remind activists that like, and citizens that like you have the power to dream up something new, that like if people had the answer, they would have done it already.
Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Sir, right here. If we can get the mic.
I think it's you.
And by the way, I have a bad habit of relying on gendered pronouns. If I use the wrong pronoun for you, feel free to tell me that I use the wrong one, and I apologize in advance.
So first off, I just want to say thank you so much for your activism, for the work that you do for equality and justice. It's truly inspiring. My question is, since you have all these tech nonprofits and tech folk here, what is one thing in tech that you would like to see that is not here? If you have like a magical wand and be like, this is something I want right now that you think would be a useful tool for activists, whether it's to connect activists, whether it's to mobilize communities, whether it's to advance policy goals, change structural equality, et cetera.
I think that, so thank you for your kind words. I'm one of many people who decided to do something to make a difference, and I'm always mindful of that. The second is that I hope that the best thing to come is something I haven't imagined yet. My push to everybody here would be like, you have to be close to the problem. There are a lot of people who like care about mass incarceration. You ask them any question about prison and jail and they like don't know anything. You're like, well, what are you building, right? Like, I don't even know what that looks like, right? So what I'm recently fascinated by is the racial wealth gap. So in 2053, it's projected that the median wealth for Black people will be $0, the lowest wealth, I guess, besides negative wealth that we have since sort of post-Jim Crow slavery, right? Which is wild. And I sit in a lot of rooms with people, and what they immediately say, and you have to remember that with white people, we like gave them wealth, right? We literally like gave people loans, didn't give them to Black people. We used the highway administration to create the suburb. Like, we did it. We gave people education, done. You say that about people of color, and they're just like, I don't think we can do it. And you're like, we just did it, like we did it for white people. But what's interesting is like sort of battling some of the assumptions. So people say things like education's a big investment, and you're like, education actually is incredibly important. It is not an asset builder. It is good for a host of other things. It just, if the goal is assets and wealth, it is not one of those things. Because what the data shows is that like, white people with high school diplomas get treated the same, like Black people with bachelor's degrees get treated the same thing as white people with high school diplomas. So like the effects of racism actually wipe out the net effects of education in some ways, right? I say that to say that like, I'm interested in people in communities like this getting close to problems like the racial wealth gap and understanding it differently to help us think about like, how do we help people build assets? Is there a way that we can help people save money differently? Is there a way that we can like help people manage debt differently, right? Like, what do those things look like? Literacy is another thing, is that there are a lot of people, the fact that all of you look old enough is that, I was gonna say something else, but all of you probably had grade level texts, like you probably all read like the same book in 7th grade, like the whole class read the same book. That is literally one of the worst ways to teach reading. It is like, we would never ever think about doing that right now because there are almost no classes in any country where every kid reads on the same grade level. So right now we give kids books that are like at their level and we have a way of coding it and whatever, right? Because that is important for readers. Is what you find though is that there are generations of people who actually never learned how to read because that was how we taught reading. So they're adults now, and we have not figured out adult literacy. Like, we just haven't done it. And the hard thing about teaching adults how to read is that there's so much shame. So when you're a 20-year-old who reads picture books, like, you will not let me teach you that in a group of people. And we don't have enough people to teach every single 20-year-old who reads at a 2nd grade reading level individually, right? I want to believe that there's a tech solution around literacy that like can help us think about this in like a deeper, better way. And like, we've not yet figured that out. And like, I think about the game changers. Wealth is a game changer. Literacy is a game changer, right? Like, those sort of things are the things I'm like obsessed with right now, besides the prison stuff and police. 1/3 of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is killed by a police officer. So like, that continues to be a problem.
Yes, back here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, what made you decide initially to get involved in politics, to run for mayor of Baltimore, and do you have any advice for people who might want to get involved, not at the mayoral level necessarily, but as policy makers, policy pushers, and people who could kind of infiltrate the political machines of the cities that we're working to change?
Yeah, I think I'm always mindful that like, our fight can't always be on the outside. That like, if all we're doing is yelling at people on the inside, like, that just will never be a winning strategy. It'll definitely make us feel good and da-da, but if the goal is to win, that's just not it. Sometimes we have to be the people just making the decisions. So when I think about, I used to be the chief of human capital for the school system in Baltimore. I used to do that work in Minneapolis. And like, in Minneapolis, we were getting all these complaints about hiring. So I was like, we'll interview everybody and then we'll finally test for sort of like mindset and beliefs. So I was in charge of hiring all employees for the district, all the teachers too. And we started asking people, do you think that students from high need communities can achieve the same grade level standards as students from wealthy communities? And about 30% of the people we asked just said no, like for whatever reason, right? And this one woman, I'll never forget, she was 25. She said to me, like I'm interviewing her, and she's like, DeRay, colored kids just like can't do it. I'm like, what? I'm like, I couldn't even focus. I was like, oh, really? But it was one of those things about like, I had the structural power to design a system that like made sure we only put people who believed that poor kids could learn in front of them, right? I didn't have to lobby anybody. I didn't have to fight anybody. Like we could just build a system that did that. So I think that's incredibly important. And I don't ever think about being on the inside as selling out. I think that like, well, we never compromised on our values and we push. And sometimes pushing on the inside looks different, right? So like I couldn't be as the chief of human capital, I couldn't be at the board meeting screaming because like I work for the school system. I could totally be like in the superintendent's office being like, Sonia, I don't think this is it, right? Like, I don't think this is it. Every day I'm like, I don't think this is it, right? Like that was the way that I had to push. And like I was okay with like pushing, looking different. We think about this idea of like, what does it mean to challenge people like a hug, right? And we think about hugs as like a little bit of love, a little bit of pressure. And like we can do that on the inside and the outside.
We're unfortunately almost out of time, but let me ask one more question briefly. If we were having this conversation 10 years from now, what would we be talking about has happened with activism, with organization, with communities of color and of the voiceless coming together in the that isn't happening right now? What's going to happen over the next 10 years that's hopeful?
In 10 years, I think we'll be celebrating some new platforms. We'll be like, wow, who was on Facebook back then? That's, I think, what we'll be saying in 10 years. I think that we'll also,
Or we'll be like, that chip inside my brain just sends Facebook
Right.
directly to my eye.
I'd be like, I think that I'm hopeful too that we will be at a place where we're like, what does it look like to build something different? That like, we think about freedom as not only the absence of oppression, but the presence of justice and joy. So we can get rid of all the bad stuff, but getting rid of the bad stuff doesn't mean that the good stuff just emerges. So I'm hopeful that like by a decade, we'll have like torn down like the bad, and we will have started to like build up like a conception of the world of equity and justice that we've not yet seen.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
We did it.
Thank you.